What's going on, everyone? Welcome back. Week 4 has wrapped up, so you know what time it is. I've got my weekly waiver wire pickups for week 5, so let's get right into it. Kicking things off, we start with our quarterbacks, and yet again on this list is Jacoby Brissett, and probably the top option in terms of available quarterbacks, and definitely quarterbacks on this list. Brissett is going to be facing the Kansas City Chiefs in week 5, which means the Colts passer is going to need to air it out if the Colts want to keep pace with the high-scoring Kansas City Chiefs. Last week versus the Raiders, even though it was in a loss, Brissett put up 265 yards, 3 touchdowns, and 1 interception. I think he can go ahead and put up a similar type of stat line, probably more yardage, somewhere in the same type of neighborhood as far as touchdowns, interceptions, which will ultimately get you a pretty decent start at the quarterback position for week 5. Next up, we've got Kirk Cousins, who, even though hasn't really done much of anything this season other than just hand the football off to Dalvin Cook, he has a potentially awesome matchup versus the New York Giants in week 5. For all the talk about how much this Minnesota offense has struggled to pass the football, I think they're going to go ahead and focus on that a little bit versus the Giants defense, which has suffered some injuries and even up until this point has given up points left and right. So look, at the end of the day, even if Kirk Cousins does struggle a little bit, I think they can always turn to the rushing attack. That's why he's going to have all the possibilities in the world to kind of get it right versus this Giants defense. And I expect a big dosage of Adam Thielen and Stephon Diggs. Now, even with that said, I wouldn't start Kirk Cousins on a week-to-week basis the way he's kicked off his 2019 campaign. But specifically for week 5 in this plus matchup, I'd go ahead and take a gamble on Kirk Cousins. Our third and final quarterback is Andy Dalton of the Bengals, and similar to Kirk Cousins, Dalton hasn't had a good start to his 2019 campaign. Very poor week 4 performances, so much so that we're not even going to look at the stats. But the bottom line is he is also having a very favorable matchup in week 5. Probably the most favorable one as far as starting quarterbacks and facing weak defenses, because the Bengals have the Arizona Cardinals in week 5, a defense that can be absolutely had and one that's been dominated by passers left and right up until this point in the season. I anticipate that to continue versus the Bengals. I think their wide receivers are going to have big days. Their tight ends are definitely going to have big days, running backs as well, and all of that is going to culminate into a big day for Andy Dalton as well. Next, getting to our running backs, we start with Nyheim Hines of the Indianapolis Colts, and this is more so of a pickup in PPR formats, and obviously it'll depend on the status of Marlon Mack's health, but if it looks like he's going to miss this week's contest versus the Kansas City Chiefs, which, like we said again, should be very high scoring, I look for Hines to have a very big involvement in this game. I'm not going to even mention Jordan Wilkins because I think this is going to be a pass-heavy type of performance for the Colts. So look for Hines to have his role as a pass-catching running back after having 6 receptions for 39 yards versus the Raiders in week 4. Continuing on, we have got Dexter Williams of the Packers. And the reason he finds himself on this list is because of the vicious hit Jamal Williams took in week 4 versus the Eagles that pretty much on the first play of scrimmage knocked him out for the remainder of the game, and he had to be stretchered out. Looked pretty bad. Now, there's been positive news coming from that front that he's doing all right and, better type of recovery than expected, which is obviously great, but you'd expect probably the Packers to take caution with him heading into this week 5 matchup. And if that's the case, we have seen that LaFleur wants to use close to a 50-50 split with this Packers backfield. So Williams will have some validity, and even more so if Davante Adams misses this game. There's going to be room for receptions here, and Williams could potentially also see some goal line work if Aaron Jones struggles. Next, we have got Jordan Howard of the Eagles, who had an absolute monster week 4 performance. 15 rush attempts, 87 yards for 2 touchdowns on the ground, along with 3 receptions for 28 yards and a touchdown through the air as well. And week's 5 matchup looks to be promising as well versus the New York Jets. Now, the problem with the Eagles is they don't fully commit to any running back, so it wouldn't be a surprise if we see Miles Sanders have a big game in week 5. But if the Jets do get out to a lead, we will see Howard, especially in the red zone, get a lot of opportunities. What I would actually do here, if I'm someone that's looking at Howard, I wouldn't view him as a long-term option. If he has a big week 5 performance versus the Jets, like we said, could very well happen, I would try and trade him the following week after 2 back-to-back big performances. Our last running back on this list is Jaylen Samuels of the Steelers, who on Monday night had a pretty productive game. 10 rush attempts for 26 yards and a touchdown, but more impressively, 8 receptions for 57 yards. So you can definitely see that this is headed in the PPR direction type of target, because with Mason Rudolph being the starting quarterback of the Pittsburgh Steelers, you can tell that he just doesn't have that long ball in his arsenal. So what does that mean? A lot of short dink and dump passes, which means James Conner and Jaylen Samuels, who is the better pass-catching running back, will have some opportunities to pile up yards and targets that way. So even though the matchup in week 5 versus the Baltimore Ravens isn't the best one, Jaylen Samuels should see enough volume, at least until Mason Rudolph gets situated in this offense, for him to be a viable option in PPR formats. Now getting to our wide receivers, we start with Courtland Sutton of the Denver Broncos, who had a big game in week 4, 6 receptions for 62 yards and 2 touchdowns. And we're finally seeing Sutton these last few games kind of start to emerge as that 1B receiver to the 1A of Emmanuel Sanders. Week 5 versus the LA Chargers. Again, Joe Flacco and the Broncos are going to have to air it out if they want to keep pace with that dynamic offense that is now getting back Melvin Gordon. So if it's not Emmanuel Sanders, it should be Courtland Sutton. We've seen Flacco not be scared to air it out, so that means there's going to be a decent amount of opportunities for Sutton. Next up, we've got Geronimo Allison for the Green Bay Packers, who probably will be at the top of a lot of waiver wire target lists. And it makes a lot of sense because Davante Adams suffering that turf toe in week 4. No specific timeline for his return, but the initial guess is that he's going to miss week 5's contest with the Dallas Cowboys. And in his absence, Geronimo Allison had 3 receptions for 52 yards and a touchdown. Now, more than likely, MVS isn't available in your leagues. That's why you're going to go ahead and look at Geronimo Allison, who, even though this isn't the best defensive matchup for the Packers, there's going to be a lot of volume going in the direction of Allison. And think of it this way positively as well. We finally saw Aaron Rodgers and that offense show us that they had signs of life and do so in a big way, scoring a bunch of points last week. And again, if they continue to struggle rushing the football, look for Allison and MVS to get a bunch of targets while Davante Adams is out. Our third and final wide receiver on this list is Mohamed Sanu of the Falcons, who in week 4 had 9 receptions for 91 yards. And while Ridley and Julio Jones struggled, Sanu found success. And I do think a little bit of that has to do with how Sanu is used, because he's just more so of that quick target wide receiver, while Ridley and Julio Jones maybe look for plays, bigger ones down the field to develop. And with the issues that offensive line for the Falcons has had, Sanu and guys like Austin Hooper, Devonta Freeman might be getting more targets in these next weeks to follow. Now, Sanu is more of a PPR ad, but again, versus the Houston Texans and the struggling Atlanta defense, which will likely give up a lot of points to Deshaun Watson and DeAndre Hopkins, look for Matt Ryan to continue airing it out and give opportunities to his wide receivers, including Mohamed Sanu. Moving on to our tight ends, where we have a lengthy list and probably the most amount of depth for week 5. We start with Tyler Eifert, and honestly, any single week where we have a viable tight end that has some type of skill facing the Arizona Cardinals, we have to highlight him. And that's exactly what's happening here, because the Cincinnati Bengals face the Arizona Cardinals in week 5. The Cardinals haven't been able to stop a single tight end they have played this year, Will Disley included in week 4. And Tyler Eifert has looked like the top tight end option for the Cincinnati Bengals. Definitely looked like that on Monday night as well. So I'd go ahead, take a chance on Eifert, and probably expect at least one touchdown versus the Arizona Cardinals, who up until now have just refused to cover tight ends. Next up, we've got Jack Doyle of the Colts, who was a tight end that we highlighted and urged you to pick up last week versus the Oakland Raiders. We said this will probably be a matchup where Jacoby Brissett airs it out successfully. No T.Y. Hilton more than likely. That means elevated usage for Jack Doyle, who is the best pure pass-catching tight end that they have on that offense. And wouldn't you know it, Doyle delivered 4 receptions, 22 yards, and a touchdown. Now, lucky for you, a lot of people probably slept on that advice, and as a result, Doyle is still available in a lot of leagues. And everything that we said for his week 4 matchup versus the Raiders is even more so true for this week 5 contest versus the Chiefs. The Colts will have to air it out a bunch. And obviously, you keep an eye out for the status of T.Y. Hilton. If he doesn't play, great. There will be plenty of usage for other pass catchers. If he does, that means a decrease in targets, probably going in the way of Jack Doyle. But in what should be a very high-scoring game, or at least high passing yardage game for the Colts versus the Chiefs, I'd still go ahead and take a chance on Jack Doyle in week 5. Next, we go to Jimmy Graham of the Packers, who had a pretty good performance versus the Eagles. 6 receptions, 61 yards, and a touchdown, including a lot of red zone targets. And the big upside for Jimmy Graham here is the absence, or at least the presumed absence, of Davante Adams. And we saw Aaron Rodgers go to Graham in the red zone. That should continue to occur, considering the type of mismatches that Jimmy Graham will have on him with opposing defenses. He's pretty much the biggest target that the Packers now have at that point in time. If they continue to struggle rushing the football, look for Jimmy Graham to get a lot of looks. Even though this will be a tough matchup versus the Dallas Cowboys, Jimmy Graham has a very high ceiling as long as Davante Adams is out for this Green Bay offense. Next, we've got Trey Burton of the Bears, who honestly, more so than anything, has just struggled to stay healthy so far this season, but he did suit up versus the Vikings. Only 2 receptions, 16 yards, nothing to write home about, but a very favorable week 5 matchup versus the Raiders, who have struggled against the tight end. And with Trubisky getting hurt, insert Chase Daniels, who will more than likely look for a lot of dink and dump passes. So that means increased usage for the likes of Burton, for the likes of Tariq Cohen. And I do think Burton will have a decent amount of usage in this game. It's probably going to be one where he's boom or bust, but he does have a high ceiling. I'd go ahead and track his status heading into that game. And if he looks like he'll be suiting up, I'd go ahead and take an outside chance on Trey Burton because of this very favorable matchup. Finally, getting to our defenses, we start with the Philadelphia Eagles, who potentially have an amazing matchup versus the New York Jets, who could very well be without Sam Darnold. The initial expectation was for Darnold to come back from mono in week 5, but right now signs are kind of pointing towards that not being the case. Obviously, you have to monitor that going forward, but even with Darnold coming back, I'd still go ahead and take a chance on the Philadelphia Eagles. I'd say if Darnold is there, they'd probably get you somewhere between 7-8 points, but if it's Luke Falk under center, that total probably jumps closer to 15-16 points for week 5. So I think the Eagles are a defense that has a very high ceiling this week. Our second and final defense on this list is that of the Tennessee Titans, who have a week 5 matchup versus the Buffalo Bills. But more importantly, it could potentially be versus the Josh Allen-less Buffalo Bills, as Allen took a nasty hit last week versus the New England Patriots, now in concussion protocol, which means it could be the Matt Barkley show for the Bills. Now, to begin with, this was a low-scoring offense. You put Barkley in there, I think it becomes even lower scoring. The Titans have a pretty decent defense. That's the strength of their team. They went ahead, held the Atlanta Falcons without a passing touchdown. So I think they can go ahead and find some success in week 5 versus the Buffalo Bills, especially if Josh Allen misses this game. So with that, we wrap up our week 5 waiver wire targets. And as always, let me hear it in the comment section. Did you agree, disagree with these inclusions? Are there guys that we missed? Comment on that as well. And if you have any other fantasy questions, let us know and we will try our best to answer them. And in the meantime, if you enjoyed, make sure to like, subscribe, and we'll see you guys in future videos.